All right.
Hey guys, welcome to the Babbling Pastor podcast. Once again with your absolutely favorite host, Michael, and
And wait a minute. Why do you get to be the favorite?
your absolutely favorite
I,
hosts. Hosts. It's
oh,
two. It's
okay.
S. It's an
All right.
S behind it. S
Okay.
host.
I
Okay.
thought, I thought you, I thought that was like subliminal criticism.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Before I forget this, guys, this is Rob. So I wanna. This might feed into our topic today, but the other day I heard of something. I think it's from like the feminist camp, but it's called weaponized. Oh, I forgot it now. Weaponized incompetence. Okay, so let me explain weaponized incompetence. Weaponized incompetence. Sorry, guys, this is how this podcast is starting. So, weaponized incompetence is when a man refuses to do something because, like, he tells his wife, "You can do it better," and so because he doesn't know how to do it, he'll weaponize his incompetence in order for her to do it. And so, like, you can think of anything, like doing the checkbook or cooking or fixing the car, whatever it is. I don't know how to do it, and so I'm not going to do it, and I'm going to need you to do it, and therefore I am weaponizing my incompetence to burden you further. So
I feel like incompetence, just by its very nature, means that you're not smart enough to weaponize it.
you're too dumb to weaponize. You don't even
Like,
know. You don't know
I
how to
don't know.
work this.
If you can weaponize that, that's no longer incompetence. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I can't fold the laundry. What human you know,
You
like
know, I'm
maybe
gonna.
there'll be some wrinkles, right? But what human being that's an adult can't fold a shirt? You know what I mean? I don't know.
I'm good. I'm gonna use
That
that against
yeah.
my kids next time. They're like, I can't clean my room. Like, well, you're weaponizing your incompetence. Is what you're doing. You.
Yeah. You're such a
Oh,
feminist.
okay, guys. Sorry. That's how we started this podcast. So, this section of podcast, we're going to be talking about critiquing pastors, right? So, being critiqued, what it looks like to be critiqued, if we've ever been critiqued, all of those amazing things. And I mean, and we were talking about this before, Rob. I know that neither of us has been critiqued. In fact, I'd say out of both of us, you are probably the least critiqued because you're
Well,
actually a
we
full-time
have
pastor.
somebody coming on, right? No,
No, no.
nobody's gonna. Well, what are we gonna talk about then? Because
Well, really, that was just sort of a what do they call that? Clickbait. That was a hook. Now we're just going to talk about. Now we're just going to talk about how amazing we are. That's the
we're
goal.
gonna talk about how to critique others. Because
Yeah,
I mean, we know how to do that, right?
yeah. What I find funny on that topic, right? So because I do sermon reviews every week, and because still against my better judgment, I am on Twitter. I got back on, by the way. So that was a dumb idea. So I always get told like, well, your review's always right? Like you're never wrong. And I'm like, you don't realize how long it took to get to where I'm at in regards to, critiquing myself and having to work through things and thinking about all this, you know what I mean? So I think as we talk about this today, we've done a fair amount of we've received a fair amount of criticism. We've taken a bit, and we are right all the time. So
Um,
you're not going to agree with that?
yeah, that's not true. That's not true.
Okay.
Not true at all. Yeah.
I think maybe we just need to end this podcast. I don't feel like you're on my team right now. I think, like you said, this has just started off. Yeah.
So we just need.
Okay.
So this is a good way to deal with criticism, actually. Yeah. Just just
Just stop
just
talking.
turn around and bolt.
You've
That's
critiqued me.
yeah. And technically, if you turn around and run, then you've repented because that's what the word means, right?
That
So
is the definition of repentance.
there's really no other requirement on your behalf than to just turn around, do a 180, and run without giving it a second thought. That's what you. Yeah, you know what? If somebody just like listens to one little bit of this podcast and like
I feel like
Then we're going to be critiqued. That's
I
what's
feel
going to
like we've
happen.
just solved all the problems. I mean, I think that's in the first 5 minutes of this podcast. I feel like we've given you information about weaponizing your incompetence and then solved all the problems of critique by saying run from them, and then turning that into something good and calling it repentance.
Yeah, yeah, I like that.
Problem solved.
You know, when life gives you lemons, you gotta make lemonade, right? So
Yes, and
that's what you
when
know.
life gives you the Kool-Aid man, you have to make Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
When the life gives you
Hmm.
turtles, you make turtle soup.
That
When
sounds
life,
gross, actually.
I've never had it. I've never had turtle soup.
Yeah, me neither. I would feel like I was eating a ninja, you know, just because of how we grew up. Like,
Oh, I saw the new one. Okay, guys, I'm sorry. So that was a buffer to see if you're actually serious about staying with this podcast. So let's go. Let's get into this. Is how the brains work. This is how the brains work. I think there's probably a technical term for it, like ADHD or something, but that's how the brains work. So, as a pastor, you are going to get criticism. I mean, is that a fair take? You're going to get some sort of criticism, right?
I think as a human, yeah, but yeah, it's certainly in this role, yeah, you'll get some criticism.
Yeah. So let's dive into first, right? Knowing that. So if you are a pastor listening to this, you know that you're going to get criticism. If maybe you are just, maybe you're just a layperson listening to this, and you're like, I don't think they get that much criticism. Let's intro with that, right? Because I think sometimes people just don't really understand how much criticism gets thrown at their particular pastor or just pastors in general. Now, I'm lucky enough to be in a group chat with a bunch of pastors. I know a bunch of pastors locally. I know you. And so I know that that's just not true. Obviously, there's a lot of criticism thrown toward pastors. So let's intro with that, right? So I think there's an idea that there's not as much criticism as there is maybe sometimes praise thrown toward pastors. So I want to try to correct that view a little bit. So we've talked about this before on the podcast. You've been in role for like about 2-3 years, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yep, since
Okay.
2020, yep.
Yeah. So with 3 years. So within that time, let's talk about the first short amount of time, and then I'll kind of talk about some other instances that I know with pastors that have been in it for like quite a bit longer, decades maybe. But was that shocking to you whenever you came into that, or was that expected? Right. Whenever you took role.
No, I think it was expected, and that only because of how we grew up, right? Like, um, I in fact, I've had it pretty easy compared to some of the stories from our childhood, right? And teenage years and stuff. Like I know that so there's a certain sense that some pastors are like depending on the denomination and how all of that works, like um that you might come along up upon some passages that worry you like, "Oh my gosh, if I actually preach this or whatever, like am I going to get voted out next week?" kind of a thing. Like, and I don't have to worry about that unless like I commit adultery or something. So like um like to some degree I've had it easier than a lot of pastors that I mean it could be way worse, I guess is what I'm saying. So because of how we grew up and some of the things that I saw there, um I it was an expectation. I mean, it's part of the gig a little bit, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, like you said, there's quite a few that we had. There's one I can think of in particular that basically even you change the music a little bit, and then all of a sudden it's like, "What are you doing? How dare you?" That wasn't. And so I think again, it's one of those things that people. I think you need to understand, and this is why I would tell people to constantly pray for their pastors, constantly try to be encouraging to their pastors, helpful as much as they can, because there are going to be things that. And when I say criticism, I guess I should probably clarify what I mean by that. I'm not talking about like hardcore somebody sending you this scathing email of, this was not exegetical and this point was terrible and you shouldn't even be a pastor, you're not qualified. As much as just like the little things. Like I know, and probably this may be because of the area that I live, but I know of at least 5 pastors that in order to like try to maybe modernize more, they would put up like a projector or something like that in their church. And something as innocuous as that for some people caused them a whole lot of criticism from people. I mean, people legit left the church because of that. And so it was one of those things. And you could say, hey, those people are being petty and da 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 da, and you'd be right. But the idea being that like even those small things, I think pastors have to consider in regards to like that's criticism toward the pastor because they made the ultimate decision there. Let's do this. Let's, for whatever reason, we're putting this up. And then you're getting pushback on something that, again, isn't even in comparison to all the things that you mentioned before that people could give you pushback on. That's the thing you're receiving criticism on. And then with that criticism comes this questioning of yourself, or at least a lot of the people that I've talked to, it does, because then you go, okay, well, was that worth it to lose this person, that person, or this family over the, you're constantly, at least again, talking to the guys that I talk to, weighing, did the ends justify the means in all of these decisions? So every decision that comes up now, you're weighing that out. Is this going to make somebody leave? And is that worth it in regards to that and having to make those decisions? And then being held accountable for if you do lose 2 or 3 families and then having to explain that decision. And so there's this constant weight of criticism and having to explain that criticism to other people that then may also leave because of the decision you made beforehand. And so I don't think people really process that pastors have that on their mind a lot of the time, at least the ones I talk to.
Yeah, it's um I think there's several, like you mentioned a second ago, there's several different kinds of criticism for sure. And so whenever any kind of criticism comes up, it's important, I think, first and foremost. um like we've all seen the clips of like the police officers, right, who uh get in trouble or whatever because they overreacted and those kinds of things. Like the reason that that's a big deal is because the police officer is supposed to be above board, right? Like they're supposed to, and it was the same way when I was in the Marine Corps. When it comes to being with the public in some way or civilians, that police officer has an obligation to stay cool even in ridiculous situations, right? When people are screaming at you or whatever else. And so there's an expectation that policeman or law enforcement officer is going to maintain his presence of mind in that kind of moment. And so whenever that doesn't happen, it really stands out and it looks bad and it's not good, right? And I think being a pastor is the same way when it comes to that, right? Like no matter what the criticism is, the first thing that you have to do is just like don't engage. If there's a temper tantrum kind of being thrown or something that someone's visibly upset or whatever, you have to remain even keel, right? Like you have to remain calm no matter the situation. um at least yeah, within reason, no matter the situation. And and so there's that, like that's the first thing. And then I think the very second thing is you have to let that person know somehow, um not downplay it, right? Y- but to act like we have to search our hearts like everybody else, right? Like we have to, if someone brings something up that is a criticism of some sort, well then, no matter who it is, I have an obligation to ask myself, is that true? Right? And I mean that's a legitimate thing. I have received criticism once before, and then the next Sunday had to say change something that I said or correct something that I said in a sermon the prior week. So and that was because after listening to the criticism, thinking about it, researching, looking at the scriptures, I had to fix that because I made a comment that wasn't in my notes that just wasn't accurate. And so, um, so that like that happens. Like there are times that you'll be criticized, and it was now to be fair, uh, it was one of my elders, which is something that is necessary, right? Like you need leadership that is willing to pull you aside and do that. And that elder did it the right way. I think one of the main things to think about, one of the main verses to keep in mind if there's a scenario in which you have to criticize or bring something up like that, is Ephesians 4:29, which says, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up." And that's the point of it, right? If you have to say something that is going to sound mean or bad or whatever, you should do it as tactfully and lovingly as possible, with the right demeanor, remembering such for some of you, remembering brother sister relationship, and the motive must be for building up. Um, Unfortunately, that's like 3% of criticism, right? But
Yeah. What I think that's a good place. So let's hit there for a second as far as like the purpose of it, right? So there is going to be
yeah,
criticism lob. So going back to the examples I gave before in regards to, whatever decision is made, there will be criticism of it in favor or not. And the bigger the church gets, or the more people that are there, and the more people that are bought into it, obviously the more drastic that criticism usually will be from one side or the other. And so at that point, it's really, I think, whenever it's somebody's bringing criticism, or even when you're receiving it, I think there's that twofold thing there of, the person receiving it, so the pastor receiving the criticism, really asking what's the purpose of this criticism? Is it just to criticize, or is it there because there's some legitimate thing? And I think from the person bringing it, that's something I've got some messages before, and they're like, well, I think this is my pastor's doing this wrong. I was like, well, have you even talked to them about it? And when you have talked to them about it, like, what's your approach been? Because if the purpose is I got you, like I got you now, like obviously I don't know, like that's not a healthy way to approach the situation as a gotcha moment.
yeah,
It's the idea of like, did you see this, or did I misunderstand you? And again, the purpose is coming at it from a humble standpoint, saying maybe I did misunderstand you, maybe I didn't hear you right. I'm just concerned about maybe the wording here, and that's what you were talking about there. Somebody came to you and said, "Hey, what about this?" And then again, it was for the purpose of correction but building up, and then you received it and saw his point and then corrected it. And that's the ideal right scenario, right? Is somebody coming and say, "Hey, I saw something and I had a question about it," and his whole purpose wasn't to tear you down. He's a fellow elder, so his whole purpose is unity and building up and making sure that you're
yeah,
above board as well. And that makes the response all that much easier, because he's coming to you in a manner that's purposeful, that's for building up. There's not a defense mechanism that goes up that says, "No, I'm right, you're wrong," right away. There's not a pushback that
yeah,
comes. There's an actual considering, like, "Oh, okay, maybe you did see something that I didn't catch." Because again, like you said, and almost always, like if somebody brings up a point to the pastor, like you said, I think I heard you right, where you said you went off your notes. So it's one of those things where it was an honest mistake. Like it's not, I mean, for every pastor out there, we have all done that at some point where we literally have our notes laid out. We go off script for a second. And normally all the dumb stuff happens when you go off script for a second. And because you haven't normally fully thought all the way through that thought. So you're very likely to say something that maybe it's not a fully developed thought in the first place, so it's going to come off as something a little weird. But being able to receive that, I think, like that scenario that you just brought up, I think is the perfect scenario in regards to somebody coming for the purpose of building up, you not being defensive about it and actually looking at it, and the end scenario being what the end scenario should be, which is correction and building up all happening with criticism occurring, right? I mean, that's
yeah, yeah. I think that's a really important thing. When the scripture tells us that we're supposed to be quick to listen and slow to speak, right? And as a pastor, that's one of the ways that applies is when it comes to, if when it comes to people who bring something up like that particular scenario, um, I've seen, man, I've seen pastors, when criticism is brought to the attention, react badly, and um, and just kind of with a "who do you think you are" kind of mentality, right? And yeah, long story short, after in that particular scenario that I'm thinking of, it wasn't long, and that pastor was let go. Because and rightfully so, right? Because um it was actually solid criticism that should have been accepted and thought through and prayed over. Um, and instead, the whole thing smelled of "who do you think you are?" talking to me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there was kind of a I'm the head guy, and I know what's right, and so we have to guard our hearts from that kind of pride, right? Because let's be clear, like a lot of times, I mean, we're spending uh, hours in the Word, coming up with the things that I'm going to talk about and say. Um, and there's not a sermon that goes by that I don't like get off of my notes some. I mean, that of course that's part of it, um but I've for the most part I've thought through all of these things. And deeply thought through a lot of these things. And so um there could be a tendency or a world in which it might become easy, at least in reflexive reaction, to be like, what, just, you know what, take a walk, pal, you know. um and so I have to, and I think anybody that preaches or teaches, you have to be ready to receive that, and actually think about it, and ask the Lord too, as well as maybe others. Like, that's a point, right? Like,
Hmm.
if someone brings something to your attention and you're not sure about it, like, we have a lot of blind spots because we don't see us as clearly in the mirror as other people do,
Hmm.
right? And so it's important for me too, when I hear something like that. Like in a scenario I mentioned before, I didn't need to talk to anyone else because I looked at it and quickly found, oh, duh, idiot, like, and so I need to correct that. Like, um there's likely going to be a need at points when you receive something like that to go to other people and say, "Hey, man, do you see this in me? This somebody brought this up," and
I, th-
so
I
that, I
th-
think that's a thing too.
Well, I think that's a good place to like interject this is that we know criticism is going to happen. That's just yeah, of course. Like there's no avoiding
Hmm.
that. But having those people around you that are going to be able to have honest conversations with you and not just be yes men or women. Like, so
Hmm.
one of the thing
Yep.
that I think happens sometimes with people is that they will have a team around them. I mean, and here's the thing. I, I know everybody's scenario is different. So as far as church size, these people may be in your church or outside of your church. At least some of them need to be in your church, but somebody that you can go to that you know is going to be honest with you, that loves you, but is going to be honest with you. And typically that needs to be somebody other than your spouse for sure, because almost all the time they're going to tell you it's fine. They will tell you often when it's terrible, but you need somebody that's very objective, that can just be shoot straight with you. And hopefully you're going to be able to have those people obviously within your church. You're probably going to need a couple outside so they're totally disconnected from the situation, but that you can go to and have those conversations with, that aren't just going to tell you, "Oh, you're amazing, you're great, you're the best communicator, I mean, like, these people are dumb." Like, because I think sometimes people separate. There's a pastor, no joke, there's a pastor. I'm going to try to be as vague about this as possible, that was receiving some criticism. And this is quite a few years ago. This is probably a decade or more. That was receiving criticism. And one of the pastors on their staff actually wrote a blog defending this person point by point about all the criticisms that was shown against them. And this wasn't like biblical, like, no, here's how he's not biblically, this isn't, it was just, I really like this guy, he's my best friend, and you guys are taking this wrong. And it was a matter of, first of all, why does that even have to be public? But secondly, like, your best friend isn't the person that you probably need to go to be like, hey, do you think I'm dumb? Because they're not going to be, they're going to see you with rose-colored glasses. And so, long story short, you need to have people around you, I think, that you're going to be able to go to and say, hey, this was a criticism that was lodged. I don't see it. I'm curious, though. Do you? And it's basically like having, if a doctor, having a second opinion from a doctor, right? Somebody tells you this, you
Yep.
go, well, I'm going to go to this doctor and get a second opinion just to verify, just to double check, just to make sure that you're not missing something and that I'm not missing something. And I think that's crucial to surround yourself with people that are going to be able to be objective and give you honest feedback and not just pat you on the back all the time. Because that, I think, is the scenario that you're talking about. I don't know the specific scenario, but what it sounds like is previously surrounded by a bunch of yes men or women, never really received a whole lot of real good criticism or took it in and actually thought through it, and just told this person, yes, you're amazing, you're great, keep doing what you're doing. And if you're not surrounded by people that are going to be able to be objective and honest with you, you're going to put yourself in a corner to where you never think you're wrong.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important too um, for us to think about. Uh, so there are, you'll find a lot more scriptures in um, in the Word that tell us um, that tell us how to do criticism, right? That and so there's an expectation on the Christian to restore him in a spirit of gentleness, right? Like things like that in the scriptures that kind of that I think sometimes whenever even if it's a legitimate criticism, it's important that we walk into that. If we're the criticizer, right? If we're the person bringing it up, it's important that we always walk into that with that "such were some of you" attitude, right? With that in the back of our mind, so that like we understand. Look, I'm not any better. This is something that I see in this person's life, or something that they did that I think needs to be corrected. But if you walk in to that situation with some kind of pride as a backdrop, it's first of all, it's gonna show itself. It's gonna be obvious that you think, like, hey, listen, you're an idiot, and I'm better than you, and here's what you need to fix about you, right? So there's still going to be a huge log in that eye, right? Right, when you go about it that way. God is not. There's an expectation among Christians that we should bring those things up, right? Because what is that particular text even says? What remove the log from your own eye so that you can see clearly to help to do that, to remove the splinter out of your brother's eye. Um, so there is an obligation that we have to one another to do that if there's something going on. But we should do it the right way, right? And a lot of times what we actually see play out is people not doing it the right way, um, and having some pride behind themselves whenever they bring something up. Um, and so that's one thing. Another thing is I think there are times that uh not times you always have to consider the source, right, of criticism also.
That was my next thing.
um
Yeah, I wanted to move to. Yeah, keep going.
yeah, yeah, so you have to consider the where is this criticism coming from. um so for me in that scenario that I mentioned, that was an elder, right, in our church, and we don't take that term lightly. Like if you're an elder, it's on purpose, right? And so these are men that I meet with on a weekly basis, and and spend time with and joke with and laugh and do work with and all of these things. Um, and so when one of those guys brought this up, it was like immediate, okay, I got to look at this, right? Um, now, to be fair, I think that no matter who brings something up, you still need to ask that question first. Is this true of me? Right. But uh, most of the time, at least in my experience, most of the time, whenever there's been a criticism of some sort that has been handled wrongly, it's from someone who could do that for a living. Right? It's from somebody who like that squeaky wheel gets the grease thing, right? Um, and so it's if you're a person, so if you're a person in your church who um, always has something to offer, let's say it that way, right? Who
I
always
love
has,
the terminology. You're offering something.
yeah, yeah, yeah. If you're a person in your church that is like consistently criticizing or giving advice or whatever, I mean, chances are, look, I love you, but chances are, ain't nobody listening. I mean, nobody. And in fact, they probably dread it. They probably dread when you walk up to them,
Oh,
even,
here comes
right?
Tim again. Tim, I bet I know what Tim wants to talk about.
And we just had a Tim join our church, so I don't wanna say
Yes,
that,
not
but,
not about you,
yeah,
Tim. Nope,
it's
not.
it's somebody else, somebody else. I'll say Hank because we don't have one of those, so Hank. But, but it really is um, a true thing, right? If you have someone who never brings anything up, who's, like, patient, kind, all of those things, and then all of a sudden they come to you and have something to say, um first of all, a person who is like that typically is going to have a demeanor that makes you that like sets the mood for someone that you loves you and you want to listen. Um, and so even someone coming to you like that is a guard for you against pride, which is helpful, right? Um, but secondly, you're gonna almost reflexively, you're going to pay attention to that because this is somebody who never does this, right? And um, so you do have to consider the source. If this is someone who is you back and forth, knowingly living in sin, struggling with anger or whatever, right? Then you can you ask the question and do some a little bit of healthy introspection, right? And search your heart and those kinds of things and ask, is this true of me? But then it's a lot easier, maybe I say it this way, it's a lot easier to let some of those things just roll off your shoulder because it's like, oh well, it's them. Right. So
Yeah. Well, no, and I think that there I think is very important. So we've obviously talked about criticism is going to happen, talked about surrounding yourself with people that are going to help you process that or can give you good feedback. And I think the people that I was talking about that process and help you give feedback are those are closer to you, more of an inner circle esque. And then moving out again to just the maybe just random people that are within your congregation giving criticism and feedback as well. And considering that source, I think what you're saying is incredibly important. If it's the person that always is not happy with how the parking situation is going, always not happy about the songs you're singing, always not happy about the setup of the service, if you change one thing, they just lose their mind. Like that person, you're almost expecting, you're like, oh, Hank didn't talk to me this week. Apparently we did everything right. like you're just expecting Hank to be critical of you. Versus, we'll call her. You got any Bettys? You got any Bettys in your church?
well, we do, yeah,
Okay. Well, here you go.
yeah. So
If
Ethel,
Betty,
Ethel,
if Ethel comes to
there you
you and
go.
Ethel's like, Rob, like I've been thinking about this a few weeks and I just had a question about something you said a couple weeks. Like Ethel didn't even want to come to you. Like she was giving you such a benefit of a doubt, and she just can't get over it. But Ethel's always before not said anything, and you can tell she's really hesitant to even tell you this. You're a lot more likely to take what she says to heart, and I think that again, if anybody, well, first of all, you've probably not even got this far in the podcast if you're a critical person anyway, and you're just always going to your pastor. But to the point that if you're wondering how should I approach it, I think be more like Ethel than Hank in regards to the fact that like, like just
Yeah.
being giving the most benefit of the doubt as possible, I think, in regard to what somebody says and how, if you have a question about maybe something they said in the sermon.
Yeah.
The approach, I think, is very important because in case for those of you listening or watching, like Rob's already said, if every week you have something critical to say, I can 100% guarantee you the critical thing you said this week, they don't even remember you said it because they're so used to brushing you off because that's all you ever bring is negativity.
Yeah.
And it's not super helpful. Sorry,
And that's unfortunate, actually. That's unfortunate, actually, because when you have something legitimate to bring up, um,
the boy that called, yeah.
it's yeah, cried wolf, right? It's a lot less likely to be taken really seriously. Um, and that that really is unfortunate because everybody has legitimate things to offer, right? One of the things that we're doing, so we don't have children's church anymore, um, which is what the as we're recording this, I have a bearded Bible thinker podcast that's coming out today, and I'm talking a little bit about that, right? Children in our worship service, and so I'm certainly not critical about churches who have children's church. There's nothing wrong with that, but um, but for us, we just where we're at as a church, we don't do that right now. Okay, so but what that means is now I have children in the service who are learning to sit in the worship time, and but while they're singing, that's easy, right? But whenever there's an old guy up there preaching and talking for like 45 minutes, which is kind of normal, um, whenever that's going on, it's like that's a difficult thing because even as adults, our attention spans are garbage nowadays, right? So you can imagine the little kid that just gets handed a phone to shut them up all the time, right, or whatever.
And they
So
don't get that phone now. They're like, what is happening?
yeah. So one of I just this past week for the first time I tried to actually at least for a couple of moments in my sermon to actually address the children intentionally. Um, and that's something that like I want criticism. So I know, like, is there something I could do differently, or how was that? Was it helpful? Like, I actually need feedback for that kind of thing. So that and I think that that's also a good attitude that we have to have all the time. I don't have that attitude all the time. I don't, but it's something that should always be worked at, right? Like I want. I mean, when it's good helpful criticism that's meant to build up, right? That's meant to help legitimately, then I mean I want that and I need to want that kind of criticism and help because it's a serious thing. If especially when we think about preaching, like it's a serious thing to be in front of people, handling the word of God, telling them what it means, how to apply it. Like that's a heavy thing. I mean, it should be anyway.
Yeah.
And so if I'm doing something incorrectly or whatever, it's just something that I should long for that kind of criticism if it's helpful, you know.
I think that's a great point. One point before we get into that though is that have you tried dressing up like Woody from Toy Story, like Saddleback Church did, to kind of get the kids' attention more as the
Are you
pastor?
serious right now?
Oh, we'll talk about it
Did
later.
that
Okay.
actually happen?
It's a real thing that happened. Yeah, it did. I'm sorry. We'll talk about it off podcast. So on that point, on that point of being
That's purpose driven.
open to criticism, um, that point of being open to criticism, I think that really helps in the flow of what we're talking about. So obviously, criticism is going to happen. Be surrounded by people that can filter that for you.
Hmm.
Have encourage people in your congregation to bring that, and you can encourage that criticism being brought, and train them in, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate criticism, and not train, but again, what we talked about, like if you're constantly critical, that's not helpful. When you're, gently critical, that's helpful. But being able to have people understand that you are open to it. I think that sometimes, because pastors get criticized so much, and there's been so much pushback because of so much criticism, bad criticism being brought, is that there's this idea within the church that some people are like, well, I have what I think is something that needs to be addressed, but
Yeah.
that culture is not built there, where the pastors openly said, like, I want your feedback, right? Because I think we live in a culture sometimes, to your point about the source, that sometimes there's so many, and I've been accused of this, and we're just gonna brush past that because there's no point in like diving into it, but of being like a discernment ministry in which like you're criticizing a bunch of pastors. And I think we do live, admittedly, in a culture where that is a thing that happens, and because people see that, they don't want to be a part of that, and so they're not even in their local church going to bring points up to their pastor that they think need to be brought up, because they don't want to be what seems like overbearing perhaps, or unnecessarily critical. And I think, again, it's this careful thing, like what you've just mentioned, to, as a pastor, build a culture in which you're saying, like, I want your criticism if it's valid. And I know that wording is a little weird, because what you're saying is, oh, you're
Sure.
filtering the criticism. I'm just saying, like, it's a matter of like, I do want it. But again, what you said, you've already built sort of the foundation of saying, I do want it if it's for building up and not just for being overcritical. Like, and that's, admittedly, that's a difficult balance to reach within a church, because there are going to
Yeah.
be people that feel like what happens, I would imagine, or what I had not imagine, what I have seen, is that that gets so unbalanced, because the people that the valid criticism that you do want, those people feel like, oh, I don't want to bring it up, even if you have like, oh, no, I want your feedback. They're like, well, it's not that important. And the people that are overly critical, that's an open door to them, and so they're like, yes. And so, like, how maybe have you? I guess there's a few examples I have in mind, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, since you've been open with your congregation to say, I do want your feedback. How are you trying to build that good balance within your church?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so first of all, it's not just me, right? Our elders, really, I think so. Let me say it this way first. I think there's always going to be, um, there will always be a kind of neglecting to do that among some people, no matter what kind of culture you attempt to build. There's always going to be sort of among, and honestly, the sad thing is, among some of the very folks that you would value criticism the most from, um, there's always going to be kind of a, um, wow, it's whatever, it's not a big deal kind of a thing. Um, but we regularly talk about that when we are having meetings with our church and that kind of thing. Like, we want to hear from you about this thing or that thing or whatever. So, as a for instance, when we did the children's church thing, um, I try. I try my best when when we're gonna do something like that, because that's a big change, right? Um, the children's church workers, uh, we talked to them over the course of some time, um, and got feedback from them, and really worked with them, and came to this conclusion. And so they weren't surprised, but there were certainly some parents maybe who were like, "Wait, what?" Um, and so I sent it by email first. I wrote a letter essentially, and it was an email, and then printed it out and put it in bulletins that for a couple of weeks or whatever. Um, but part of that was I made the case that, like, some of the things that we thought about to get to this conclusion, and then And then from there, it was like um, I think one of the things that squashes garbage criticism that I try to do is I try to like because I already know. I mean, at least 80% of the criticism that would come fits into these 2 or 3 things, right? And they need to understand that I've already like we've already thought about
Yeah,
those 3
I'm not
things, right?
surprised. Yeah, if we it's
Right.
crossed our mind.
Right. And so I'll bring up, maybe thing 1 and thing 2 or whatever and say this is, I'll give a little bit of an explanation of that, but then I'll legitimately say, I think I said in that letter, that toward the end of it, a lot of churches will take times like this to really begin to get at one another, and it'll be a cause of dissension and struggle among brothers and sisters in Christ. Let's not do that. And I just point blank will say something like that, and then just after that, it would be that call, right? Like if there's something that you want to talk about, something legitimate that you want to talk about, or if there's a way to make this transition easier that we haven't thought about yet, please come and talk to us. Let us know. And you know what? I've had some ideas from that. Uh, and so what that does is I think at times those who would would quickly come to you with, well, why, like that crowd reads that and goes, well, all right, whatever. I guess I'm not going to say anything, which is what you want, right? Because they need to understand that dissension. Look, we do church discipline here, right? And like if you're causing division, that's a problem, and that's something that'll get brought up, right? And then the criticism will go both ways in a sense, right? Like, and so they need to know that, like, this isn't the typical church that you get to just run your mouth and be sinful all the time, and it's fine. Um, and uh, so that I think having that culture, okay, a culture of church discipline where we take sin seriously around here, and the culture where you're open to legitimate criticism, that's kind of a tough balance at times, right? Because some people might feel like, well, God, I don't want to be a jerk. Like, is this, am I, but is that not where we want people, right? Like to be thinking, is what I'm about to do actually sinful? Is my heart, is my motive pure in this? um, is what I have to offer. I mean, is it legitimate? Right? Is it something that's real, or am I just looking at this the wrong way? Um, so that by the time criticism gets to you, typically it's not that like, oh, why would you move the chairs? It's like that stuff doesn't happen here. It just doesn't, because we don't care. Like we don't put up with that kind of stuff. It's like it would just be ignored if that's how you came at it, right? But but at the same time, we do have people that come to us. I had a gentleman who came to me and really struggled with how I looked at Israel and the church. That's how it started, and then we it really turned into um, he struggles with how I come with how the process by which I come to some conclusions in the scriptures, and so anyway, this conversation started, and I meet with him now like every other Wednesday at 2 o'clock and just chat about the Bible and talk about it, um, and that's been awesome. I mean, it's been challenging, right, for both of us, and so that was a criticism kind of thing that was helpful and good, and it has helped me grow as a pastor, and I'd like to think that it's helped him grow a little bit, um, and we've certainly grown closer together, even though we have things we disagree about. It's actually helped our brotherhood to do that. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah. So that culture I think gets built by talking about it, like any
Hmm.
culture. It gets built by talking about it a lot. And then when criticism comes to you, like we actually have made changes in our worship setting on Sunday mornings from legitimate criticism before.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think what you're talking, like, just listening to you talk through it compared to the examples that I said I had, I think really it shows a process of maturing believers, the elders and pastors included, versus some of the examples that I have, which are just frankly immature reactions to situations, because that
sure.
system of maturity hasn't been really built up. It's just amazing, like what you're saying there in regards to there's a system set up that is built for the mutual benefit of brothers and sisters in Christ, where there is this line of, well, we're doing this because it has biblical backing, and there's you're welcome to criticize, and we're going to have this discussion. And that's, like you said, as far as the example you gave of you and this guy sitting down and talking through it. And again, it's the iron sharpening iron. It's not like you're going to agree with everything, but there is this mutual building up and discussion, and minds really being challenged in, where you sit and why you sit there, versus what typically happens, I think, which is criticism either being lodged at somebody and the pastor or the elder trying to actually process through that and the person being immature about it, or legitimate criticism coming to the pastor and just, or elder, and not wanting to hear it at all, and this person is done because they brought it up. And obviously, as we've already talked about, the person that brings it and where that criticism is coming through, like, there's a lot of factors that play into that. But ideally, the place you want to end up is what you're describing, I think, is this mutual building up in community of believers, for, again, not that you're going to land in the same spot, but that you're both mutually challenged and grow in your thinking process. You guys being, as far as if we're going to use this children's church example to keep going through it, you've already said, there's things that you set down clearly. I think anybody that listened to this can sit down and thought through this process. What would be the objections? What would be the answer to those objections? Like sending out the letter, but you even afterwards, you're saying people came to you with, you're like, oh, didn't consider that part, and being able
Mhm.
to accept that and kind of work through that and think through that and kind of take bits and pieces of that and apply where it needs to be and not where it doesn't need to be. Versus, I think what happens a lot of times, or again, the examples I have, where I'll just use the projector screen as one example, because it's easily accessible in my brain. But somebody coming and saying, hey, I saw this happen in another church before and it was terrible for the church, da, da, da. And the pastor would be like, well, I think for the direction we're going as a church, this would be helpful for XYZ. And then that person being like, well, I'm done with this conversation, and then leaving the church. And it's one of those things where again, I think it's mature believers interacting versus immature believers, whichever side it falls on, interacting and, just not being mature about the situation. And so when we're talking about criticism, I think hopefully it's been clear as we've kind of went through this conversation that obviously it's a two-sided thing. It relies on the maturity and the ability of both people to approach the system in a way that, accepting and receiving in a mature way and really thinking through the process. Like what you mentioned before was great, where it's not knee-jerk reaction criticism. It's actually saying, hey, when I go, what is the motive behind why I'm going there? Like, is it because I'm just mad and not seeing things, or is it because it's legitimate? Like, being able to disciple a people in the way of actually thinking through a process is like, we're just not used to that anymore. We live in the age of reaction videos. Something happens, I go to my car, right? Like that's the age we live in, not thinking through things. And so to be able to disciple and train up a people that actually says, I'm going to sit on this for a minute. I'm going to think through this. I'm going to actually consider, am I coming at this wrong? And having pastors that are able to say and accept and go, okay, maybe I'm not seeing this right, and be able to process through that, and having people around them that are not just yes men that want to build, that want to just pat them on the back all the time. I think all of that, what you've described, And again, I say this a lot to people, and you say this right back when I say it, but like you would admit you're not like the perfect church. But I think when I recommend people and be like, hey, you should probably check out what Rob's doing because I think it's a good system. Um, I think what you've described is really healthy in regards to building a system within your church that encourages feedback, but those people also know that it's not going to just be like, okay, like there's going to be pushback to that, healthy pushback to that feedback so that a conversation can happen amongst, like you've already said, brothers and sisters. And I think that's so, like, that building up in maturity is so lacking right now,
Mm,
really.
yeah. Yeah. So I just real quick, I actually pulled that email up that we sent out. And so this is actually what that portion of it sounded like. This is what we so I mean I kind of made sure that we are that they understand that we love their children and we want that, and then anyway kind of made the case and said this is kind of what's going to happen, and then I said though we have elders with children within this age group, we realize we don't know everything. So we're open to entertaining suggestions to help with this transition. We look forward to showing one another grace as parents usher in children who haven't been accustomed to being in the worship gathering. And as those of us who haven't been in those shoes for quite a while learn to get used to the beautiful God given squeaks and squeals of children as they learn to worship with us. And then I said, Satan has historically utilized transitions like this to prowl and prey on saints and cause division, pride, resentment, and outrage among God's people. Let's commit together to see that before it happens, and pray for parents and children in our church. Let's commit to having cordial, godly conversations about it if there's disagreement. And lastly, I would ask and even expect that as God's people, anyone who is struggling with this decision in any way would come to us directly and seek answers to help during the adjustment. And then that was kind of so that's kind of
Well,
that's actually what was sent out that I was
I,
talking about.
I like that line that, come to us directly instead of, hey, put the Facebook post out or,
Yeah.
hey, start a group message about your
Yep. Yep.
disagreement on this. Like just cutting that off
Yeah.
at the pass.
And that doesn't, I'm not under some kind of delusion that that happens all the time, right? Of course, people do that. Of course, people are going to have conversations amongst themselves and go, "What do you think about that? Like, why would they?" So like, this isn't perfect. This doesn't perfectly play out, but the idea is that there's an attempt um, to 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 make it perfect. Like there's an attempt to make it clear. I got a couple of emails back that said thank you and one that said you have my support, and then had some conversations with people that it's been fine, and this isn't a small thing because we have a church that like we have a lot of kids in that age group. Um and we have 6 women who are pregnant right now. So,
Not only do
like,
we have a bunch of kids, we got a bunch of
yeah,
kids on deck coming in.
you're right. That's absolutely right. So, so it like this isn't just like, hey, you too, your kids aren't going to have a thing anymore, right? This is something that affects a lot of people. Um, so I mean, it was kind of a big deal, a big change. But I know there are churches that we grew up a part of that, like if at least that kind of culture, that if elders, first of all, if there was such a thing, but if they would have sent out an email like this and put it in the bulletin, there would have been outrage, right? Like just because of the change, and that's not a small change. That's not like you moved a chair, right? That's a ministry is changing.
Well, yeah, that's
So
an entire, yeah, that's a, Pastor, I don't think you understand. I have a hard enough time paying attention. That's going to make it
yeah,
like, at that point, my feet would be like, I'm sorry, your nap's interrupted. I apologize. No. So, so let's like the
yeah,
very end here. So I think what we've covered is in church stuff right now, right? So everything we've talked about so far, I think, is very inside the local church, that sort of thing. And one thing I would be interested to discuss as we kind of close out this section, right? And just to review, let's review real quick, is that we've talked about the idea of like, obviously criticism's coming. You should have
Mhm.
people around you that are helping you sort of process that
Yes.
criticism in a very close circle versus a wider circle. You should make all effort, whether you be a congregant or a pastor, to have those building up conversations for maturity and really thinking through and not really doing knee jerk reactions for the benefit of everyone, right? What would you do? And part of all of that, I guess, has been considering the source. We've really come back to that a lot, and I want to continue that theme, considering the source and considering how the world is set up now as far as the internet. Everybody streams services. Everybody, or most
Yeah.
people, not everyone, most people stream services. So let's say, and I don't know, I'm throwing this out as a hypothetical because I don't think it's probably happened, but let's say it does one day. Somebody streams your service. Somebody says, hey, I was over here in Kansas, I saw you preaching and you said this thing that I disagree with. Obviously, we have to have considering the source here. Obviously, you're
Mhm.
not, Craig Groeschel from Life Church, or I mean, there's obvious bigger pastors, bigger names are going to get much more criticism. So, as a hypothetical, let's say you get some emails from people from outside of your church. Obviously, we're considering the source here, but how would you take that? Because we do live in a digital age where
Yeah.
anybody can
Yeah.
watch your stuff. Anybody can email you. Anybody has access to you, indirectly, I suppose. So how would you consider that coming to you from somebody, some blow Joe out in Nowhereville that you've never heard of before? Um, has that happened? And then how would you take that, I guess? Because interesting
Mhm.
time we live in.
Yeah. I do not get. No, I'm just kidding. I think, um, so first of all, that's not, and I think rightfully so, that's not something that I keep up with, on the regular, right? So if so, this would have a better chance of happening because of a podcast that I do as a pastor here, because more people take that in than watch the sermon or whatever, because that's like, who has 50 minutes or whatever. So, um, but but either way, no matter what it is, it's still a digital age, and so the first thing that you have to do, I think, is understand. So there's a trend, right, going on, and you very likely have had to deal with this because of your podcasting and your YouTube videos. There's a trend right now where like churches will lodge complaints or sue or those kinds of ridiculous things, because somebody said something mean about them on the internet, right? Or critiqued them in some way they didn't like. Um, and I'll say first of all, uh, that kind of thing, actually shows that the criticism was probably correct. First of all, and secondly, though, that's something that like when I understand that, whenever I say something in the public sphere, I have then opened myself up and made it, okay, to be critiqued, in that venue. Um, of course, the best thing to do would certainly not be that somebody makes a whole YouTube video about it and never tries to comment or reach out to me directly or those kinds of things. Um, but I'm not famous enough for that to happen, so that's fine. But um, uh,
Yet.
uh,
Yet.
you have, likely had some, from time to time, something like that go on, um, but so I think in principle, if I do see, a comment like that, I do run across it, um, I'm gonna, first and foremost, treat it the same in the sense that I do need to read it, and I do need to ask myself, "Is that right?" Because my first goal, not as a pastor, but as a Christian, is I need to grow. And I'm not perfect. I don't know everything. So is this a legitimate criticism, of me or of something that I've said? Um, and now, because it's not someone from my church, it's not someone that is part of the flock that God has given me to have oversight. Because of that, it's probably going to mean less to me, and that maybe sounds bad, right? But I certainly don't mean it to be. But but you but I'm still going to take it into account and hear it. But uh, us coming to so let me say it this way, maybe what I mean by it means less to me is I really don't care as much about some internet person in the ether and I coming to terms and getting along afterward, right? But in my church, I mean, we have to do that. It's more of a forced thing. You have to maintain relationships and even grow closer together in those relationships. So you don't you at least in my view, I do not have that same level of obligation with someone I have no idea who they are on the internet from Kansas, you said, or whatever, right? It doesn't matter. And so I'll take the criticism. I might even say, "Hey, thanks for whatever," or I might say, as nicely as possible, "Yeah, you're crazy," right? I don't know. It just depends on what's said. Um, but I think you you take the criticism seriously, okay? You uh, you don't care about like it should be easier to brush off your shoulders, right? Um, and then you react to them if you've again, like the first caveat being I don't really check that stuff. um, uh, and so that doesn't happen real often, but um, because the internet has a way of like it's just part of the culture to criticize everybody, right? Um, it's just what you do, especially if you have X or Twitter. I mean, if you have that, that's what the whole culture is. It is nothing but you saying something and then getting slammed for it. Like that's what the whole
Yeah.
thing. The only time you can't do that is if you just share a verse, uh, legitimately from the scriptures. Then the only time you'll get criticism is when you share a verse that has to do with homosexuality or something. But um,
That's
uh,
about accurate. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, if I shared, John 3:16 on the internet, it would be like, "Yeah, that's
Well, or no
fine."
one cares. They
Right,
just keep scrolling. They're like, "Oh, that
right.
doesn't hit my
Yeah,
outrage sensor today, so I'm just gonna keep going."
yeah. Okay, this is off topic, but it always surprises me. I guess it doesn't anymore, but like it makes me think about it, right? Whenever I could post all sorts of things on Facebook that nobody cares about, and it's always the Christian things, right? Like I could post a verse or a quote that's really good from like Spurgeon or somebody, um, and nobody really cares. So it might get like two people, but as soon as I share something about one of my kids, it's like boom, it blows up, and there are like 50 people or 60 people that like it, and all these things. Yeah, I always find that interesting. But
Gotcha.
so
So
there's my criticism
no, you're
for
good.
the internet.
So I think so. I think what the approach you have is really good in the sense that like the pastors that I know that have received, and again, these are not like big famous well-known pastors. These are pastors that literally only stream on the internet because they started back during 2020 and they just keep doing it now. And there are random people that come in from nowhere that have somehow found the streams, and maybe just like from social media clips they post and then they find it and they go watch it because whatever, people do that. And most of the feedback, or when I've had conversations with them about it, the feedback, whether it be good or bad, they just kind of like, okay. And it goes back to your approach, like you said before, like you're not part of my local church. So like I appreciate it, I guess, but it doesn't really impact them because they're kind of like, you're not here. Like you're not part of the body. You're not, as far as the local body goes. I guess thanks for the criticism, but or thank even for the positivity, but it's just kind of like, okay, thanks. And I think that goes back, and a lot of this we don't have time to get into. A lot of this I think plays into your view of the local church. Like, do you see the internet people that watch out in Randoville as part of your local body or not? And that goes again back to the church. There's some churches that literally have Elevation has an EFAM. And so their EFAM is equally like they count them as actual people on their attendance stuff when they put out their yearly reports. And so it's a matter of like, how do you view that? And, does that criticism, I think how you view that views how you weigh that criticism. And almost all the pastors I know, they're like, I don't like thanks or who cares as far as when the criticism comes in. And I think that goes back to what we've talked about before in regards to the source of where it comes from, right? There are pastors, and again, I'll speak to my very, very unique situation in which there are pastors that have like submitted copyright claims on sermon reviews I've done of them. Because I was critical of something they've said, not Mark Driscoll, that have just completely taken, the video down. And so that's whatever. I mean, they're fair to do that. And then I have had pastors that have reached out. That wasn't anybody's name. I literally had to clear my throat there. That there have been pastors that have reached out that have said, "Hey, I saw this clip because somebody sent it to me. And, I don't think you were necessarily fair in your estimation." Now, again, that's only happened once. And when it did, I had some other people listen to it that, again, that I knew would be, transparent and open with me about if I had done it right. And they got back to me and they said that I maybe probably wasn't as, I was a little overcritical. So we took that one down and did another one of this particular pastor. And that did change how I do things now. When I do the review, I send it to the pastor via DM or email, if whatever way I can get a hold of them, so they at least know it's out there. And what I always say, this isn't about you personally. This is about the sermon you gave and us kind of looking at the sermon, but I understand how it could be taken as personal. And I want you to know it's not. It's just that your name was submitted by somebody. We're looking at your sermon. If you have an issue with this, you can reach out to me. Because at this point, it's big enough to where people now care. But the point being is, considering the source. And that's what I told the pastor that reached out. Like this isn't about you. This isn't me. Like, I'm not a part of your church. I honestly don't think you should consider anything I say because I'm not there. But I think that does come down to the digital age where it goes like, consider the source. If anybody not that anybody's going to watch this, that's going to have a sermon review done about them. But if I do a sermon review about somebody, I want you to be like, I don't care about your opinion because I don't think you should care about my opinion. I'm not part of your local church. I'm not involved in your local body. Again, I'm not even coming after that person. I'm just saying like, hey, let's look at how we should listen to sermons. And so I think for people that do have, and I hate this term because I don't consider myself this, but I get lumped in all the time, discernment ministries that constantly attack people. And all they do is show the negative and all they do is go after clips. That's what did we say his name was? Hank. Those are the Hanks of the church, right? And unfortunately, whenever the Hanks of the church maybe do have like a really good take on something that people should pay attention to, people don't pay attention to it because Hank's been over here criticizing the whole time anyway. So all that to say that it's not, I don't think anybody outside of your local church should really be taken incredibly seriously. What you said, I think, is helpful, where you say, okay, I'll take in the criticism, but it's obviously weighted different for you because, I'll listen to you, but I don't really, I'm not, unless somebody else in here within our local body has said it, I'm probably not going to really pay that much attention to it. And I just wanted to include that in this because I think in the digital age, it often goes outside of our church. And I just really want to make it clear that if somebody sees a sermon online that I preach and they're outside of my local body and they say something, I really don't care. I just don't about your opinion at all, because I got 5 pastors in my church that I trust to call me out on stuff if I do say something wrong. I have a lot of people within the church that I know are going to be super honest with me. So your opinion means nothing. Just to be quite frank with you. But I think that has to be something you think through, because sometimes when you're online, if you get bombarded enough, that can matter to you. And I don't think it should. There's been pastors that I know that like a clip of theirs goes viral, and they're not like huge pastors, but a clip goes viral. And believe me, I know on the other side of the internet, you can get bombarded with negative stuff. And I would like, again, not that this podcast is going to go wide and far, but don't let that get you if that does happen. That opinion doesn't matter. Who are you called to shepherd? Are they
Yep.
being shepherded well? Are you building a community of people, like you said, that are maturing one another? I think that's the goal.
Yeah.
That's the point. And theirs are the opinions that matter. So,
Yeah, and not only that, but when you think about it, um, just from a biblical perspective, uh, there are a lot of people in our nation, okay, and our culture, who would say, "I'm a Christian," who are not, right? Who don't even fit a rudimentary definition of what a Christian is supposed to be, and so what and I think that the internet is absolutely filled with those people. Um, and so I think here's the point that I want to make with that. If you are faithful, if you're faithfully preaching, and that's what people see, if you're blunt about the truth and you're honest about what a text is saying and some of the implications with our culture, with family life, with whatever, um, criticism is really not only expected, but it's if you never get criticized, if people are assuming people see it, and if you don't get criticized, you're probably wrong. Like that's probably a criticism in and of itself. Um, but because if the internet doesn't have anything mean to say to you, um, then probably you weren't right.
or you weren't on the internet. How can you get on the internet and people
Yeah.
not be mean to you?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Yeah. But like it just like I mentioned Twitter because it's I don't have a lot of experience dealing with what you're talking about, like the internet part, because certainly people have seen my podcast some. I have some subscribers and things like that, but and so I've had some comments, but nothing like what you have or what you're talking about. Because I'm on the internet, but I'm not really on the internet. I'm on the internet as far as my people are concerned,
That's a
like,
good
but
take. That's a good position to hold, Rob. Keep holding that position.
so, so, but if I'm there, the world should hate what I have to say. Let me say it that way, right? The world, and that includes people who are goats in the church, right? People who claim to be Christians but couldn't care less about their Bibles, like it for real. Um, who claim to be able to believe and yet not obey, right? um, those kind of folks, and all the way up to those who are bluntly following um, anyone but Christ. Um, it, it would be weird if they didn't have something to criticize in what I have to say. It probably would mean that I'm a little too fluffy, right? Or that I'm just uh, or that I'm just playing to a crowd and trying to build people up without any interjection of truth. Like, so um, the moral of that story is I don't, I want to make sure that that if I'm going to be online and there's some kind of presence there, um, I want to make sure that I'm not too sensitive to that, right? Because it's absolutely going to happen. In the local church, that should be a little different, right? Like you shouldn't receive all that kind of criticism, especially look, if people are sticking around in this church, it's because it's chiefly because they enjoy the blunt truth of the word being preached, right? So I don't have that issue here. Um, because those kind of folks will come for a Sunday and go, "Yep, not for me. Where's the Furtick church around here?" Right? And so, yeah, because I want to be built up and have the energy to get through my week and come back, right? So anyway, yeah, I'm sorry.
No, you're
You don't
good.
have to.
Okay,
But
so I hopefully, this section where we're talking about criticism is helpful to you. If you're a pastor listening, I think there's plenty of stuff here that I think that hopefully has been helpful to you in order to kind of process through. Again, if you've been in ministry for a while, I think you've already come across all of this. Hopefully you've heard some things that maybe you haven't heard before, haven't considered, or maybe you think you can work into it as far as what Rob's talked about is his sort of system that they're doing. If you're new, hopefully it's just been encouraging to you in general. And if you're a congregant, I think one of the best things that I think you can take from this is what Rob you said earlier, which is like just stepping back for a minute, becoming a mature believer and really thinking through, obviously I need to be critical for the sake of truth, but I need to really think through that criticism and how I approach it well. If you're never being critical, I think again, you're not really thinking through things very well. But if you're being overcritical, I think you're having a knee-jerk reaction. So what we're really shooting for, in my opinion, is that middle ground of saying, I really do need to be listening carefully, and I really should be critical if something's said that's not right. But I need to kind of weigh that in the balances and know when to speak and when not to speak, and when it's helpful and when it's not helpful to do so. And same as pastors, when should I listen and when should not? I should just brush it off. So hopefully that's been helpful to you guys as you've listened through this. And if you like it, you should probably maybe put that like button down. And if you don't like it, we don't want any feedback at all, and you can leave. I mean, that's what we've really learned today. So hopefully,
yeah,
I'm being
get out of our lives.
Hopefully, I'm being consistent. So, guys, thank you, as always, for listening to the Babbling Pastor Podcast, the best podcast on the entire internet, with your best host, Michael, and your other host, Rob.
Boy.
You had to be here from the beginning to get that joke. We'll talk to you next time. Bye. Bye-bye.
Later.